in the glittering courts of medieval Europe, where crowns were currency and marriages were weapons of peace or war, one little girl found herself in the very eye of the storm. Her name was Isabella of Valois, a princess born into one of the most powerful dynasties of France, wedded to an English king at just 6 years old, and widowed before she was 11. This is not the story of a warrior, a schemer, or a ruler. This is the story of a child, used as a pawn in the cruel chess game of politics. But Isabella's life, brief and quietly tragic, offers us a rare glimpse into the brutal mechanics of royal diplomacy, the fragility of peace, and the sorrow of lost childhood. What happens when a girl is promised to a crown rather than a childhood? What becomes of a princess who is too young to understand the world she's traded into, but old enough to feel its heartbreak? Let's peel back the velvet curtain and look not at the battles, but at the girl left in their wake. This is the haunting story of Isabella of Valois. Isabella was born on November 9, 1389, in the opulent Hôtel Saint-Paul in Paris. Her father was King Charles VI of France, a monarch plagued by terrifying fits of madness. Her mother, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, was ambitious, politically shrewd, and known as much for her extravagance as for her fierce protection of her children. The court into which Isabella was born was lavish but volatile. Charles VI's frequent episodes of madness were whispered about in every corner of Europe. Sometimes he forgot who he was. Sometimes he attacked his own men. And every time the king lost his grip, a power vacuum appeared, one that various factions scrambled to fill. This political chaos shaped Isabella's world. The Valois court was a battlefield, but the weapons weren't swords. They were marriages, alliances, whispers, and inked agreements. From the beginning, Isabella's life was shaped not by fairy tales, but by treaties. France and England had been at war for decades. The 100 Years' War was tearing apart generations. Kings, nobles, commoners, no one was spared. Peace was an illusion, but the kings kept trying. And so, when a new round of peace talks began in the late 1390s, one idea kept resurfacing: a royal marriage to bind England and France in peace. And who better to offer than a princess? Young, innocent, and politically pliable. Isabella was the perfect candidate. Beautiful, regal, and very young. Too young to argue, too young to refuse. At just 6 years old, Isabella became a bride. Her husband, King Richard II of England, aged 29, let that sink in. A 6-year-old girl handed over to a grown man, not as a wife in the romantic sense, but as a symbol. Her marriage was a treaty dressed in lace and pearls. In 1396, the union was solemnized with grand ceremony in Calais. The French and English courts came together for the rarest of events: peace. The wedding was a spectacle. Lavish clothes, processions of knights, musicians, heralds, banners waving in the cold sea wind. Isabella wore a gown so heavy with gold and embroidery that she could barely walk. Chroniclers recorded that she looked like a little fairy tale doll, bewildered and overwhelmed. Richard, by contrast, was regal and composed. He spoke kindly to her. He promised Queen Isabeau he would not consummate the marriage until Isabella came of age. Some reports say he even took a paternal attitude toward her, more like a guardian than a husband. Still, the image of a child being led by the hand to an altar beside a grown man tells us everything we need to know about the priorities of medieval politics. It wasn't love. It wasn't companionship. It was strategy. Isabella's journey to England was a long and solemn one. Her entourage was grand, yes, but it was also isolating. She did not speak the language. She had no friends her age. Her mother had stayed behind. Her father's mental state meant he was unreliable at best. Isabella arrived in England as a girl queen without a voice, and yet Richard tried to make her comfortable. He gave her her own household at Windsor. She was surrounded by ladies-in-waiting, tutors and attendants. She learned English slowly. She studied embroidery, music and dance. She had dolls, pets, and even a miniature throne. On ceremonial occasions, she was dressed in velvet and pearls and seated beside Richard in state. But behind this glittering curtain, England was crumbling. Richard II was not a king at peace with his people. He ruled with increasing paranoia. He exiled or executed nobles who challenged him. His court was divided. He taxed heavily, spent lavishly, and silenced critics. When he left for Ireland in 1399, hoping to suppress a rebellion, he underestimated the storm gathering behind him. That storm had a name: Henry Bolingbroke. While Richard was away, Henry Bolingbroke returned to England with a small but determined army. He capitalized on Richard's absence, winning support quickly. The people welcomed him. Nobles defected, castles surrendered. Within weeks, Henry had seized London. When Richard returned, it was too late. He was arrested, imprisoned in the Tower of London, then moved to Pontefract Castle. Isabella, now only 9, had no idea how fast her world was unraveling. She was placed under guard, her household restricted. Her correspondence with France was cut. No one told her where Richard was. She was a queen, technically, but no longer treated like one. In February 1400, Richard was dead. Some say he was starved. Others whisper he was bludgeoned. The truth is likely grim and simple. A deposed king was too dangerous to live. When the news finally reached Isabella, her reaction was heart-wrenching. Chroniclers say she refused food. She locked herself in her chamber. She cried until she was too exhausted to stand. She was just 10 years old. Her status as Dowager Queen was not recognized by the new regime. Her jewels were taken, her servants replaced, and yet again, her future became a bargaining chip in the games of men. Henry IV now ruled England, and Isabella, Richard's widow, was a liability. At first, Henry offered to marry her to his son, the future Henry V, but Isabella refused, fiercely. She reportedly told envoys that she would never marry the son of the man who helped kill her husband. This was more than grief. This was defiance. For the first time, Isabella showed the strength behind the silk and titles. The French court demanded her return. Negotiations dragged on. She was shuffled between castles, watched constantly, denied visitors. Her isolation deepened. Letters from her mother begged for her safe return. French envoys pleaded. English officials stalled. Finally, in 1401, after over a year of captivity, Isabella was allowed to return to France. She was still technically Queen of England, though Richard was dead and his memory erased by the new king. She arrived in Calais under guard, but was greeted as a heroine. The French people saw her not as a failed bride, but as a symbol of unjust suffering. But she had changed. Gone was the bubbly child bride. In her place was a somber, guarded teenager. Back in France, Isabella's mother began searching for a new match. Isabella was now politically useful again, but this time the choice would be French. At 16, she married Charles, Duke of Orléans, her cousin and a poet. He was kind, cultured, and closer in age. Their union was said to be peaceful, if not deeply romantic. They shared literary interests. Charles wrote poetry, hundreds of verses, some possibly for her. She became pregnant with their first child, but fate was cruel. In September 1409, Isabella went into labor. Complications arose. She gave birth to a daughter, but Isabella died shortly after. She was 19. She had lived through a marriage at 6, widowhood at 10, imprisonment, exile, and finally, a brief period of peace. She had barely begun to live. Her death sent shockwaves through the French court. Charles was devastated. He would later be captured at Agincourt and spend 25 years as a prisoner in England, a tragic mirror to Isabella's own captivity. Their daughter would die young, and with her, the last direct link to the girl queen who had once been the hope of 2 nations. History did not sing ballads about Isabella. No great epic was written in her name. No cathedral was built for her. But her story is stitched into the seams of Europe's troubled past. She was used, mourned, forgotten, and rediscovered. She represents the cost of politics, the cost not paid by kings and generals, but by children born into power they never asked for. Isabella never wielded a sword. She never issued a decree, but her very existence shaped peace treaties, royal successions, and the fragile balance between France and England. her quiet resistance, her refusal to marry Henry's son, her grief for Richard, her yearning for home. These were the only weapons she had, and she used them. In every history of the 100 Years' War, her name may only be a footnote. But in that footnote lives a child whose story is more human than most kings and queens combined. Isabella of Valois died young, but her story lingers, not as a cautionary tale or a political tragedy, but as a portrait of dignity under impossible circumstances. In a world of crowns and daggers, she carried neither. She bore her sorrow with grace, her silence with strength. And though her life was brief, it forces us to reckon with the true cost of power. When you look at the portraits of queens in gilded frames, remember Isabella, the child bride, the silent widow, the forgotten queen. She never ruled, but she endured, and sometimes that's the bravest story of all.